types of data collection tools, outline the procedure for construction of a data collection tool. These are the two objectives that I will be handling. After this, Dr. Animesh will be taking over and he will be handling the questionnaire and rating scale part of the session. Now let us go into what is data. Data as defined by the dictionary comprises of facts or figures from which conclusions may be drawn. Now it is a collective recording of observations which could be either numerical or otherwise. Now what is data collection? The process by which a researcher collects information to answer a research question is nothing but data collection. Now how do data collection techniques help us? Data collection techniques help us to systematically collect information about the objects of study, which may be people, usually patients in terms of medical research. It could be an object or it could be phenomena, and about the setting in which they occur. Now, data collection tools have been changing day by day because there are a large number of personnel getting involved in data collection, and newer methods are available such as computers, mobile apps, etc. And so methods of data collection and data collection tools have changed. Now I want all of you for a minute, some of you can unmute your mics and share your experience on these two aspects. What are the ways of collecting data and how have you collected data? Dr. Sriharsha, can you unmute some of the participants so that they can speak?
Yes, I've done that.
Yeah.
Well, we can collect data through surveys.
Yes, very good.
And maybe through research papers as well, if we are referring any research papers.
Okay, very good.
We can collect data from a set of questions in the questionnaire format.
Okay, so questionnaire is one of the ways of conducting a survey, which someone already said. Then any other methods?
From IPD patients or OPD patients.
Questionnaire, site schedules.
Okay, schedules. Somebody said patients. What data
From
do you collect
OPD.
from patients? How do you collect the data from patients?
By Performa.
Using your proformas. Yes, you have to design a proforma and use the proforma. Yes.
Making use of standardized scales.
Standardized scales. Very good. Very good.
Through some
Anything
special
else?
test.
By observation, by surveys, by interviews.
Somebody said special tests. What special tests?
Medical record section.
It can be psychological tests, biophysiological tests, observations, field notes.
Okay, excellent.
We
Most
can
of you
collect data through case study also. If we are studying a
That's really excellent. Most of you have listed out almost all the available data collection tools or commonly used data collection tools, making my job easy. Dr. Sriharsha, can you mute them so that I have less disturbance and I can continue?
You can go ahead. I'll be doing in the back.
Yes. Thank you very much for making my job of continuing this session, making this session easy for us. Now, before selecting your data collection method or a data collection tool, what you need to understand is which or what kind of data you want to collect, how you should collect the data, who is going to be collecting the data, and when the time frame at which the data is, the particular data is to be collected. Only once you have determined this, this forms the basis of choosing your data collection method and tool. Now, what else? Your data collection method also depends upon the research problem, the design of the research, and the information that needs to be gathered during your research process. Now, there are two types of data: primary data and secondary data. Primary data is data that is collected directly by the researcher or by a trained data collector. Now, what are the methods of collecting primary data? As already pointed out, they are specifically, these are data that are specifically collected for the purpose of research and comprise of surveys, interviews, and observations. Secondary data collection methods. Secondary data involves use of data that was already collected for various purposes other than current research. So what are the methods or what are the sources of secondary data? Patient records, nurses' notes, census reports, and somebody said already published literature. Published or unpublished data can be a source of secondary data. Now, what are the advantages of primary data? Primary data is tailored according to the research needs, and the researcher can determine exactly what data will be collected and identify the specific tools that will be used. Primary data collection involves a defined and consistent protocol, and one can ensure that complete data is obtained. The disadvantage of primary data collection is that it is time consuming and it relies on subjects' recall and communication abilities, and bias can occur due to various factors, and one needs to check the reliability of various raters. Collection of secondary data is relatively easier and quicker, and it is devoid of researcher bias. It is economical and time saving. Participants' cooperation may not be required for collecting secondary data, and it eliminates the bias that is related to participant awareness. The disadvantages are because it is from a already available source. It might lack accuracy, completeness, and reliability depending upon who collected the data originally. It may not be suitable for answering a current research question. Sometimes, most of you would have encountered this when you go through retrospective review of patient records. Some data is missed. You find that certain data are inaccurately mentioned in the case records. And so you have a problem with missing data or inaccuracy of data, because inaccuracy, I can give you an example of inaccuracy. Suppose you are referring to an audiometry record of a series of patients. One audiogram would have been conducted in the hospital that you are working. There might be an audiogram record which has been collected in a different hospital, and different settings will lead to inaccuracy in the audiogram. So for research, it is essential to standardize the setting in which the data has been collected. So if we collect the data, if it is a primary data, then we will be able to ensure in the research protocol that the settings in which the audiogram is conducted are uniform and standardized, right? So that is an example. Biases can be there when you collect secondary data. Now, you need to understand what is a tool and what is a method. A tool is a device or an instrument that a researcher uses to collect data, whereas a method involves the various steps or strategies that are used for gathering and analyzing the data while conducting a research. Now, Dr. Sriharsha, please unmute the participants again. I will give you certain research titles or research questions. I want you to identify what are the tools involved in this particular research and what are the methods. You can name one tool and one method. So I want to study habit-associated oral mucosal lesions among the people of Dakshina Kannada. What tool will we use and what is the method by which you will study this?
Retrospective method.
Retrospective method. What
Maybe
will...
observing the lesions, mucosal lesions.
Questionnaire and oral
Observation.
Questionnaire will be used.
Interview method.
Observation and finding out the mucosal lesions.
Okay.
See, more workers they'll be having the disease. For that, they're going to treatment. If we take the retrospective, what the treatment they take, and we can start the study and you can change that one, what the medicine they responded or not.
No, here we are not looking at the treatment. We are looking at the prevalence of habit-associated oral mucosal lesions among the people of Dakshina Kannada. So what tools we will use?
Tools,
Questionnaire.
Mucosal lesions.
Questionnaires.
Yes, we will use a questionnaire and probably we will use a case
cross-sectional.
pro forma to outline the type of lesions each person has got, right? Okay, now next, one more example. I want to study the acoustic and aerodynamic characteristics of voice among primary school teachers. So what is the tool and what is the method?
Voice measurement tool.
We can use checklist.
Voice measurement tool.
With a checklist, how will you study the characteristics of voice?
Because if the we can think about whether if there are the 5 symptoms like characteristics has to be present, we can think whether symptom A is present, yes or no, B, C, minimum characteristics. Can we do it, ma'am?
No, here
We have to use a software.
Measurement with
yes, I'm looking at objective measurements of voice. So the method of voice will be by analysis, voice analysis using software in the voice laboratory. But what is the tool I will use? The tool that will be used will be a pro forma. A record will be maintained. I will study the primary school teachers. I will record their voices and I will analyze those voices in the voice lab, and I will record the details in a particular pro forma. So the pro forma is the tool, whereas acoustic analysis or aerodynamic analysis is the method that will be used. Now, effects of Indian classical music on sleep patterns in depressed individuals.
Pro forma.
Pro forma,
Questionnaire.
yes.
Questionnaire.
Ma'am, observation.
You need to do observation. Sleep pattern. How will you observe a sleep pattern?
We will have a standardized tool to sleep.
We can measure the melatonin levels.
See, here you have to
Rating
of depression has to be done. Grading and grading of depression has to be done. So rating scale will be used. Sleep patterns will be studied. It can be done based upon patient's self-rating of the quality of sleep. Also, you can study sleep patterns objectively in a sleep lab, and then you can do the intervention and record the sleep patterns. Intervention using Indian classical music, and then record the sleep patterns in pro forma, right? Comparison of hearing outcomes following ossicular reconstruction using homologous incus versus total ossicular replacement prosthesis or partial ossicular replacement prosthesis. So what are the tools and what are the methods? See, here I want to assess hearing outcomes. So the method of assessing hearing outcome is audiometry, right? So before the procedure, I will be doing audiogram, and post procedure I will be doing audiogram, and then I will be recording the audiometric data in pro forma, right? So the tool used will be a pro forma. Now, this is an example of a pro forma. This is designed by Dr. Animesh Jain. This is epidemiological trend of malaria in Mangalore. Look at the data he has recorded. One year, for example, we say 2020. So he has recorded the total number of cases in January, February, across up to December. So that will give you a total number across the year. And then the number of patients each month, how many males, how many females, and then further divided into age groups. Then how many deaths happened in January up to December, and the total number of deaths across the year. Now, how many were in active surveillance, how many were in passive surveillance, and then the outcome, how many were cured, how many died, how many left against medical advice, how many relapses, and how many recurrences. So this is how we record an epidemiological trend in a pro forma. This is a clinical research pro forma where you want to record the medical history of a particular patient. So does the patient have a medical or a surgical history, current or resolved, of any of the following? Suppose the patient has a medical history, that is symptoms suggested to a head, eye, ear, nose or throat complaint, then you will write yes or no. If it is unknown or unknown, if yes, then you have to explain what kind of complaints that patient had in this column, and then in the next column you will say whether that particular complaint is present currently or it has been resolved. So also you can record other complaints. So this is a clinical record pro forma. Now, suppose you want to observe a patient during the course of particular treatment or diabetes mellitus. So before treatment, so first the details, the name, age and the gender of the patient, the address and the occupation. You happen after treatment, right? 1 day after treatment, first follow-up say after 3 months, second follow-up after 6 months, next follow-up after 1 year. What happened to this patient? So this is a pro forma that has been designed by the Ayurvedic Medical Association for an Ayurvedic drug for diabetes. Now, when we have multiple data collection instruments, that is usually happening during a clinical research. You will be collecting details regarding the demographics, the contact information, the baseline data, then the first visit lab data and the subsequent visits lab data, patient morale questionnaire, visit the blood workup at particular visits, observed behavior of the patient, and then the completion data. And then when the project is complete, you will have a project completion questionnaire to be given. So you will have a checklist like this as to what was collected at what particular visit, so that you will have an idea what is pending and what needs to be collected at the next visit of the patient. So this shows the red points indicate what was collected at enrollment, what was collected at visit 1 and what was collected at visit 3. And the blanks show what is pending collection. Now all of you talked about observation. Observation is a technique of collecting all the data or acquiring information through occurrences that can be observed by an observer by his own senses. It could be voice, you all said, by listener's perceptions. Using your hearing, you can understand whether the voice is good or the voice is hoarse. By observing the patient with your eyes. So you can either observe by your own senses or you can use mechanical devices for observation. So we said sleep patterns we will do in a sleep lab, polysomnography. So that is a mechanical device. Okay. So what does observation help in? Observation helps in understanding an ongoing process or a situation. It helps us to gather data on individual behaviors or interactions between people. It helps us understand a physical setting, and observation helps where other methods are not possible happening. It does not rely on people's willingness or ability to provide information. And a checklist for observation, whether he or she did that particular step or not, yes or no. That is all what can observation with. But you will not understand to what level that person performed unless you have a rating scale. Now, what is a checklist? One of the methods of observing a person is by using a checklist. So checklists include several items on a topic and require the same response format for all items, yes or no. So it is whether it is present or absent, whether it is yes or no. So it includes listing of the steps, activities, and behaviors which are to be observed when an incident occurs. And it is very useful for evaluating skills, behavior, conditions, personality, manifestations, etc. Now let us look at a checklist. Here, the objective was to evaluate a student's performance during surgical dressing, and that particular procedure has been divided into 12 items, wherein the student explains the procedure, arranges the equipment for convenient use, prepares the patient, washes hands, maintains aseptic techniques, removes the dressing, observes the condition of the wound, cleans the wound, applies the dressing, makes the patient comfortable, and completes the charting. So here, what one does in the checklist just ticks yes or no. So what is the level of performance of the student is not checked over here. Whether the student has done it or not, that is all is checked using a checklist. We all have this as part of our case records. This is a surgical safety checklist, right? So before the induction of anesthesia, there are certain things that one has to follow. Before the skin incision, the surgical checklist is read out. And before the patient leaves the operating room, we have a checklist which we tick, which is read out and ticked. Now, how does this checklist help in, right? So here you see there was a study of reduction of mortality, surgical mortality in Scotland by the use of the WHO surgical safety checklist. So doing the study using this particular checklist that is there in the patient records, they concluded that since the implementation of the WHO surgical safety checklist as part of an overall national safety strategy, there has been 36.6% relative reduction in perioperative mortality. So this is how the research question would have been, does the surgical, what percentage of reduction happens in the mortality by use of the WHO surgical safety checklist? This would have been the research question, and by analyzing the surgical safety checklist, which is part of the case records, they have concluded that there is a reduction in the perioperative mortality. Now, you have other checklists such as the audit checklist and score sheet. So here there is an example of an indicator score for planning in the nursing process techniques. Here it is not just yes and no, but you're also having a scoring pattern for the various checklist items. This is a daily medication checklist, whether that particular medicine was given at that particular time, and it has to be ticked in that checklist itself. Now, what are the advantages and disadvantages of checklists? Checklists allow for inter-individual comparisons, and it is a simple method to record observation, and it is useful in evaluating learning activities, and it is useful in containing the attention of the observer, and it decreases the chances of error in observation. The disadvantages, we already discussed this, it does not indicate the quality of performance, so its usefulness is limited. Only a limited content of overall clinical performance can be evaluated. Only the presence or absence of attribute, behavior, or performance parameter can be assessed, and degree of accuracy with which the person performs a particular task cannot be assessed using a checklist. Another method of observation is by using a rating scale. Now, rating scales look like checklists, but they are used when finer discrimination is required and one needs to indicate the degree to which a trait is present. They provide systematic procedures for obtaining, recording, and reporting an observer's judgment. Now, there are three types of rating scales: a graphic rating scale, descriptive rating scale, and a numeric rating scale. Suppose you have a group of children and you want to rate the activity level of the child. So infant A, B, C, D, E. So you will rate as hyperactive, active, moderately active, poorly active, and dull. So this is one of the rating scales. Another example of a rating scale where we are rating medical education values from strongly agree to strongly disagree. Educational research only tells us things we already know, whether we agree or we don't agree, and whether we strongly agree or strongly disagree, or whether there is no opinion at all. So this is again another example of a rating scale. Suppose I have trained interns in practicing universal standard precautions, and I want to assess the degree to which the interns practice universal standard precautions in the ENT ward. I can grade them again on a scale of 1 to 5, from very poor to very good, right? So this is again another example of a rating scale. Now, another example of a tool for data collection is a spider diagram. Spider diagram is a visual brainstorming technique which helps to organize concepts and ideas logically so that we get a complete overview of all the information. So at the center of the spider diagram will be the research question, around which you will have a web of concepts. So it uses spatial organization, color and images to break down the topics. So let us look at some examples of spider diagrams. So what is at the center? Why do penguins make great pets? Now all the concepts have come around in the web. So here is another example, reasons to work visually. Now, this is a study done to understand how much research experience people have, right? So various components in the research methodology have been split into the spider diagram. The center will be the experience in that particular area of research methodology. The next method is a cognitive interview. Whenever we design a questionnaire, people give a response to the questionnaire, but we do not know why a particular individual responds to that particular given question in a particular way. So for this purpose, cognitive interviews are used. Cognitive interview is a psychologically oriented method for empirically studying the ways in which individuals mentally process and respond to a survey questionnaire. It is conducted for the purpose of enhancing the understanding of how respondents carry out more commonly conducted for the purpose of pre-testing questions and determining how they should be modified prior to a survey and to make them more understandable or easier to answer. Now here is an example of a cognitive interview. So the researcher asks in that question, in the cognitive interview, why did you give that response? And there are prompts for the follow-up. Does that reflect how you are feeling right now or yesterday? What about last week? Under what circumstances might you have put top or bottom of that particular scale? What did that question mean to you? Was it easy to understand, or did you think it might have meant something else? To understand whether your question is, clear to that responder or not. So if it is not clear, if it has meant something else other than what you are trying to assess, then you can modify the question so that it is more clear for the respondent to understand. What did you understand by the particular word that you have used in that questionnaire? So if you suspect that a particular word is problematic, then you can modify that word. Was it easy to decide which response to choose? So this is how a cognitive interview is done. Now there are, let us look at observational methods. Observational methods could be naturalistic or controlled. Naturalistic is where you observe a particular behavior in a natural setting. Controlled, where you observe behavior in a setup situation. Now, there is another type of observation wherein you have the participants are aware that they are being observed. Suppose we do a direct observation of procedural skills among the postgraduate residents of ENT. And I tell the student that tomorrow I'm going to assess your ability to perform an indirect laryngoscopy. The participant is going to be aware, and that kind of an observation is called as an overt observation. Now, when I observe the participant the student, the postgraduate resident, during the course of his performing a particular surgical skill or a particular clinical examination skill without them being aware that they are being observed, that is called as a covert observation. So what happens during this type of observation? A researcher can understand the real behavior if the participants don't know that they are being observed. But then there are ethical issues concerning certain deceit and informed consent performances. Informed consent is required when we have when we do covert observations. The next thing is the researcher can be a participant to the situation that is being observed, or the researcher does not take part in the observation. So non-participant observations allow the researchers to observe behavior that would be impractical or unethical to take part in, such as alcohol or drug abuse. Taking part in an observation can lead to observer bias. Other type of observation is structured or unstructured, wherein we look at certain predefined behaviors using a coding system or a checklist, or you record the behavior as you see. Now, structured observations give us quantitative data, and those can be analyzed statistically. So, observations help us look at how people actually behave, but because they often look at specific situations, they are difficult to replicate. And so with observations, reliability is often an issue. Most commonly, we use case record forms for collecting our data. This is usually used as part of most of the research that we conduct or our postgraduates conduct. So let us look into the case record form. A case record form is used to collect and record information that is required as per the research protocol in a particular format, and it ensures that there can be uniform recording of data by different observers. Case record forms allows efficient and complete data transfer to the master chart. Now, what should be the attributes of a case record form? Case record forms should have the identifying details of the particular individual that whose record is being maintained. They should be simple and clear. The fonts should be readable, and there should be simple, short questions. Suppose your case record form has a question saying whether the person has got fever and cough. It is confusing. So you should have a separate question for fever, separate question for cough. We should avoid open ends. Suppose we are studying the site of involvement of oral cancer. So you can't leave it open, site of involvement, and leave it a blank for somebody to fill in. So you should be specific, saying whether it is lip, buccal mucosa, hard palate, anterior surface of the tongue, floor of the mouth, retromolar trigone, and so on and so forth. Now, suppose you want a particular value, say hearing threshold or airborne gap. You have to collect the particular value of the variable. Or you want the duration of a particular symptom. Example, ulcer in the mouth. So you will have to collect the particular value, say in weeks, 6 weeks, or if it is in months, you have to specify 3 months or 6 months. Okay. Now, suppose it involves collecting repeated measurements. Suppose I am assessing voice prior to any surgery and what happened to the voice after the surgery. So I have a list of parameters such as fundamental frequency, intensity, harmonics to noise ratio, and shimmer. I should record each of these measurements. As per the study protocol, I want to assess these parameters preoperatively, first day postoperatively, and then the 15th day postoperatively. So I have to create a table so that I can fill in repeated measurements. Now, this is again an example of a case report form. This is usually used for clinical research. So this includes the participant number, what is the study group, then the study site where the data has been collected, whether the participant met the inclusion criteria or not, date of the informed consent, date of birth or estimated age of the individual. Now gender again. This is where I said you should not leave a blank for the person to fill in. You should give an option 1 or 2. Pregnant, yes or no. The date of enrollment, did the person have malaria in the last 28 days, yes or no. And then did the person take an anti-malarial in the last 28 days, yes or no, or unknown. So this is how a case report form has to be created based upon the research protocol and the data that is required to be collected. So the different data collection tools could be abstraction forms, structured observation guides, and questionnaires. Abstraction forms include review of records, clinical records, and surveillance record. Structured observation guides include checklists of items, and questionnaires could be interviewer administered, face-to-face, telephonic or computer assisted, or self-administered, paper-based or computer-based. Now today you'll also see a lot of audience response polls on the television, Kaun Banega Crorepati. That is also a type of questionnaire. To summarize, data collection techniques and data collection tools. So when we collect data using available information, the tools involved are checklists, data compilation forms or sheets. Observation could be with the researcher being a participant or a non-participant. It could be using one's own eyes, other senses such as listener perceptions, pen or paper based, watch, scales, microscope, otoscope, all other tools. Interviewing using interview guides, questionnaires and checklists, surveys, questionnaires, and then we have various scales such as the Likert scale, visual analog scale. These are all rating scales. So these are some of the data collection tools that we have looked at. I request Dr. Animesh Jain to take you through questionnaire design and designing a rating scale.
Thank you, Dr. Vijayalakshmi. I will start with my presentation now. I think.
Yes.
All right. So let's start with the second part of it. So now Dr. Vijayalakshmi has given you an overview about all the different tools for data collection, and she's also given you a good idea about briefly about all of them and mainly about the case record form. Now let's proceed, and as you know, the objectives have already been told. So I will be dealing with the latter half of it, the basics of questionnaire, steps to design it. If time permits, we'll go into Likert scale. Maybe I'll just quickly go through that. And this is the outline. So basically, when we decide on a data collection tool, now Dr. Vijayalakshmi with examples and with interaction, she's already told you how do you go about. So basically, when you choose a tool, it's decided based on your objectives, also on the basis of your literature review, and then you can also take some expert opinion. And very importantly, after all that, if you think that there is no feasibility to employ that tool, like for example, if you want to do an interview, but you don't have people to do that, or if the geographical area is too far and wide, now you may not be able to do that. So it may not be a feasible option for you. So you need to decide based on these things. Now, as you all know, questionnaire or a proforma is a set of things that you want to collect, and then based on that you devise a tool which is consisting of some questions or certain parameters which are listed out, and this is needed by almost everybody, whether it's the interviewer or the researcher, the respondent, the data entry operator, the statistician, the authors for paper, data monitoring committee, the institutional ethics committee or IRB in the Western countries, quality control team, anybody and everybody, and including the if you're sending it to grant proposals, proposals for grant, then also for those teams. Before we proceed, let's look at what is the difference between a questionnaire and a schedule, because many times people confuse between these two things. So questionnaire is basically, it's a technique of data collection which consists of a series of written questions, and many a times it also has alternative answers. It can have open questions, but it can have alternative answers listed as well. Whereas a schedule basically is a set of questions in which the statements and spaces for answers are there, and it's provided to people who will go and collect data based on this. So there are enumerators or there are interviewers, and they will go and meet the respondents and note down the answers based on this. So who fills it? Obviously the questionnaire is filled by a respondent, whereas the enumerators or the interviewers will go to respondents and fill it. The response rate usually of a questionnaire is low compared to a schedule. The coverage obviously is larger for a questionnaire because you can send it, and nowadays with the availability of all these tech things like Google Forms and things like that, you can just send it to a large number of people, whereas schedule will be restricted to a smaller number. The cost, obviously the schedule will be more expensive, not just because the cost involved in printing as well as the cost involved in the employing the people who will interview. Whereas in case of a questionnaire, it will be much economical. Even nowadays, you can use an interview schedule online as well. I mean, through the media like telephonically, but again, you need to spend on that. Respondent's identity is usually not known in case of questionnaire because most of them are anonymous, except in times where you want it specifically known. And schedule, you will know it usually. The success of the questionnaire relies on the quality of the questions that you put in, the quality of questionnaire, whereas in the case of schedule, it's the honesty or integrity of the enumerator and the interviewer. And people usually need to be literate to answer the questionnaire, whereas for a schedule, you don't require that because automatically the interviewer or the enumerator will speak in that whatever language and they will explain. So that's the difference. Now, when you start off to make a questionnaire fresh, and these are the points for fresh questionnaire if you're making or you're modifying. So these are the things you need to keep in mind. So list out what information do you need right in the beginning. How would you use this information? Is it already available? If so, then based on that, again, you can, tailor make it. Ask questions that are only essential, because many a times we have this feeling, let's collect it, let's, we'll see, baad mein dekha jayega. We'll collect it as of now, anyway we are doing it. So that's also not really required. And always put yourself in the shoes of the respondent. If you were a respondent, how will you respond? So view questions from the respondent's angle also, and be selective and realistic. Now, going by the kind of information that we can collect from a questionnaire, it helps us in getting these kind of information. What people already know or what's their knowledge, what they think, know or feel, what people do, that is how do they behave, what are the practices, and what are the characteristics or what attributes do they have. So these are some of the things that is clubbed as 4 different types of information. You can have multiple of these information combined when you design your questionnaire. Coming to the knowledge, quickly give you an idea. Basically, you can have questions which give an option between correct and incorrect so that you can elicit whether people know that correctly. But many a times this is not a good idea because guesswork is also possible. Again, you can check between true, false, or you can just ask questions which will elicit their awareness. So some examples are listed below, like, what is the major cause of accidental deaths in children? So you are asking them and they will come out with answer, or true or false, or like something like a fill in the blank. So you can have those kind of information. Then again, you can have beliefs, attitudes, and opinions of the respondents. And when you come to that, it can elicit the psychological state of mind of people, or their perception of past, present, or in the future what they perceive, or things like that. And this is usually their opinion. So it's the respondent's opinion. So is your opinion in your opinion, how does it go? So like, for example, in your opinion, does positive self-esteem prevent drug abuse among adolescents? So it's the respondent's opinion. Maybe not in the line of the common opinion, but this is respondent's opinion. Or what do you consider the biggest challenge facing our children in the community in the next 2 years? Or, for example, to elicit attitude, place them in a situation. So would you attend a course on biostatistics if it were to be offered in your city or in your institution? So what is their response like? So something like that. Coming to behavior or practices, again, what people have done or do now or maybe plan to do, so like something like that can be elicited. So again, you have questions like that. Now, one caveat of this is, or one limitation is, that when you ask questions, now it's just the respondent which is giving you the information and you go by that. But many a times you know that this has a limitation. What happens is, when you ask questions, people usually will try to show you the best side, or they will try to go with the opinion which is usually expected. So this may not be a good idea to elicit practice or behavior in a true sense. So this is like whatever self-responded elicited information you get, that's the limitation. Best would be you observe, as Dr. Vijay Lakshmi told you, observation would be a good idea to do for this. Now, all these you can ask and you can go by it, but with that limitation, as I mentioned. Coming to the attributes of the characteristics of people, it can be anything like age, education, occupation, income. So basically, it tells you who are your respondents, their demographic, their socioeconomic characteristics, all these things. So it can be anything with their income, their age, their marital status, their family, number of years of work experience, what is their qualification, anything and everything. So that's about the information that you elicit about the participants, because many a times that may have a bearing on your the data that you gather, and you might want to associate that. So to summarize, you can get 4 types of information, that is knowledge, beliefs, attitudes and opinions, behavior, and attributes. So these are the 4 different types which can be singly or in combination asked. Now coming to the key elements. Now please remember, there are certain things. I'll just briefly touch upon this in the interest of time. Please ensure that there is clarity, because if the clarity is missing, you will not be able to elicit the data that you are looking for. So it has to be very clear. It should not mean something to me and something else to somebody else, and the third person something else. So there has to be absolute clarity when we put up a question. Then there has to be balance. Now I cannot have too many of one type of questions. Many times we see KAP studies, which are very common, knowledge, attitude and practice studies. You have, if there is, for example, if I have 20 questions or 25 questions, I will have 12 or 15 questions on knowledge. I will have 1 or 2 questions on attitude, because obviously they are very difficult to devise, and sometimes people feel that, okay, let's just do it for the sake of, because it's called KAP, and then you will have some questions on practice. So there is no balance. Similarly, like when you have certain other elements, so there should be a balance, good balance on the questionnaire. Then the length. Now this is one of the common things which I'm asked many a times. What should be the ideal length? What do you think, Now I don't have a definitive answer. I'm going through so many literature, and with whatever experience I have, I've never found a definitive answer. To very simply tell you, keep it what people will be willing to answer, and we know, depending on the type of people we are going to, the respondents or the topic at hand. Now I'll give you an example. I have seen questionnaires from Europe which go on for 40-42 pages, 20-25 pages, and people answer. But going by our experience, 3 to 4 pages, and people will be, oh, too many, or this much I have to fill. So it depends. But at the same time, if you're approaching certain people only, who have been shortlisted, and then you think that you can approach them and then you can convince them, yes, fine, go ahead. But at the same time, keep it in such a way, as I said, don't take too much of junk, that just collect, have some idea of the purpose. Then order is very important. If you have started off with a fresh questionnaire that you are devising, now what happens is many times our thoughts are just haphazard and we keep putting and jotting down. That's okay. That's fairly all right. There's no problem. But once we have done that, try to group things in order and also put things together what are related. Because if you start jumping from one thought to another, the fleeting of thoughts also happen when the people are answering. Now that's not a good sign, because that will lead to people not answering the things properly. And also many a times people will lose interest halfway. So you don't want that. Now coming to the context, always give a context, or it should be in the context. Now I cannot suddenly ask something which is out of context. If I'm doing a research on, say, for example, I'm trying to look at people's perception about coronavirus. I can't suddenly ask something else which is unrelated. So it has to be in the context. Present that. Now coming to components, just again to give you an idea. Now there is always a good idea to put introduction and conclusion. I learned it during my PG time thanks to one of my teachers, Dr. R.P. Pai, who always used to say, you should have a thing which starts with something like dear participant or dear sir or madam, we are doing this study. So you put up that and then objectives are spelled out. So that's important. Please also remember, nowadays it's very important to have your ethics approval, and please put up an informed consent statement which is there, which explains the purpose as well as some basic things about which are the requirements, and we will have another session which will talk about these things as well. So have those things listed as well. And then in the end, it would be always nice, so if I'm filling up a questionnaire, isn't it nice to say thank you for your time and cooperation, we appreciate your time, your efforts. So that concluding statement, and then so that's good even in a paper statement, a paper questionnaire. Then think of identifiers or code that you may want. You may not want to identify participants all the time if it's anonymous and all, but you might want a code or something. Or if you want, you can have something written for serially documenting later. So you can have that. Then your instructions. Please fill this questionnaire in this way, or maybe choose an appropriate answer, or multiple answers can be opted for. If you think that if something is answered as no, or if it doesn't apply, they can skip and go to number so and so. So if I say question number 3 and answer is no, please skip to question number 10. So that's a skip pattern. So all that instruction, and please make sure that instructions are very clear and they are different from the body of the questionnaire, because sometimes they might be lost. People don't concentrate and they might be lost. Coming to the body of the instrument itself, you have open-ended and closed-ended questions or closed items. I will discuss that in a little bit. So open-ended is basically you're not restricting the response of the participants. For example, if I were to ask people, what is your age? And people will tell me whatever their age is. So that's an open-ended question. I can also ask this question in a different way by putting it, please tell me which age group do you belong to? And I can say 31 to 40, 41 to 50, or say 31 to 35, whatever. So I can close it. And people will have to choose between those categories. So here, I have given them restricted choices. Or the other option is like, you say, do you like this particular movie? The answer could be yes or no. So again, that's closed-ended. So basically, like, if I put up a question like, what is your opinion on capacity building of faculty in educational research? I'm leaving that to the respondent to answer. Whereas I can give choices like yes or no. So have you attended a workshop? And the answer could be yes or no. Can't be, not sure or don't know. So again, please be a little careful. Many a times we think that this is an open-ended question. Now, I'll give you some example and give you some ideas. Now what happens is, when I put a question like, how do you feel about whatever, this particular webinar series, for example. Now I'm giving you a free kind of hand to describe your feelings. But if I say, how satisfied are you with? Now I'm already presupposing that you're satisfied. Now that becomes a little difficult because people start having that kind of a notion and then you're restricting their choices. At the same time, when I start an open-ended question with, are you satisfied with? Again, it's again becoming difficult. So please remember that when you make an open-ended question, it should be ideally a totally really an open-ended, not just, making it a little presupposed or preclusive kind of a thing. Coming to the wording of questions, it's a challenging task, and especially if you're starting from the scratch or if you do not have much of an experience, that's okay. But we all learn with, passing of time and by trying and error, making errors. So once you're starting a new questionnaire, please remember, you think of 3 things in mind. 1, who's your target population? Who are you going to administer it to? Then, what is the purpose of the question? Why are you making this question? Or what exactly are you planning to do with this together? And the placement of questions in relation to each other, which can come a little later, as I said. So these 3 things are the most important things which you need to think of. Coming to the wording of questions. Now, please always remember, keep things simple. Keep things simple. Use simple words. No confusion, no double meaning. Whatever the words are, it should mean very simply what it's intended to mean. It should not vary. So there's no confusion at all. Avoid using abbreviations. Many times we try using abbreviation, jargons, foreign phrases. Now, even simple things like HTN, many a times for health professionals, it's common, hypertension. Now, many a times the common people may not understand that. For them, hypertension also sometimes is not clear. Some people know it, but many others don't. So for them, high blood pressure is better. Similarly, I use very commonly this particular thing. Now, if I were to ask somebody, are you feeling sick? Now, especially in this part of the world, in subcontinent, Indian subcontinent, when we say sick, people will think that I'm not feeling well, I'm feeling ill. But you ask this in America, and you say, are you feeling sick? And they will usually understand that as feeling nauseated or feeling like vomiting. Now that's the difference. So you need to understand what context. Many times you would have found a question from the Western side or from America, and then you use that. And there is, are you feeling sick today? And that doesn't mean that are you not feeling well? And that's what I'm trying to drive home the point. Be specific, but try avoiding being too precise. Like many times we say, are you involving students, or are you involving people who are older? Now, what do you mean by older? Or if I say last year. Now, for example, if I say last year, this year, it is 2019. But for example, if I continue the study for a year, and when I reach January next year, now January when I collect, 2019 will not be my last year. So be specific. Now, again, specific is okay, but too precise. I asked somebody, how many times did you use library for more than 3 hours in the last year? Do you think I can remember? I mean, many a times we don't remember what we did last week or last month, and you're asking about the whole year and this kind of a thing. So is it really required? What's the purpose? So please think of that. Use clear wording, and this is again one of my favorites. Many a times we've seen questionnaires which say occasionally, often, majority, or most of the time. Now the thing is, it doesn't mean the same thing to everybody. So either do not use it, or if you're using, please define for this purpose, for the purpose of this questionnaire, or for the purpose of this question, occasionally means this. So for example, I can say occasionally means once in a week, or say once in a month, or whatever. I can define that. Or once in a fortnight. Often means more than thrice a week, or more than thrice a month, something like that. So I get an idea as a respondent. Otherwise, my often may not be same as somebody else's often and the researcher's often. Include all the necessary information. Now, for example, when I ask this question, how many times did you use the library for more than 3 hours? And I don't say when. Now, the participant may be lost. I said last year. Now he's thinking. If I say within the last 1 week, now the time period makes it easier for the person to respond. So include the necessary information, whatever is required. Now, many times we want to gather sensitive information. Now, this sensitive information, sometimes it's best left to be to a later stage, and especially if it's an interview, once you build a rapport, then you go on for asking these questions. Even if it's listed early, I would say that suggest that use that list it later. But if it's listed early also, even if it's an interview, so try to ask it later. It need not be always asked right in the beginning just because it's listed in the front of your questionnaire. For example, again, if you have to ask them in some way where it will not really offend the person, because once you offend the person, it becomes difficult. Many times people might just switch off. They might just, if it's a questionnaire, they'll say, okay, forget it, I'm not going ahead, I'm not doing it. Or they might just say, okay, enough, I just quit. So you need to ask that in a particular way and try to make it a little less objectionable. Like, for example, I've given you. Now, if you ask somebody like that, obviously I will feel very offended. Now, sometimes we don't realize, but our questionnaires, in the enthusiasm, we make it in such a way that we want to gather so many things. Now, for example, please rate the following 20 items in the order of your preference. Now, that's too demanding. I will think, oh, 20 items, and again, if I'm asking it to say 20 people also, forget about 100 or 150 or 200 people or more. 20 people answering this 20 items in different ways, so many permutation combination. What will I really make out and how will I get something out of it? So I'll have to really put my mind and think that do I really want it, or I just want top 5 versus something top 3, something like that. So that would be a good idea. And at the same time, it will improve my response rate. Use mutually exclusive categories. Many times you would have seen questionnaires which have things like this. Now, if I want to say 30, where do I put it? In the first category or the second category? Or if I say, where did you get to know from? Friends, colleagues, peers. Again, my colleagues might be friends, or my peers might be my colleagues as well. So again, it becomes ultimately like, if you're making it multi-optional, that's a different thing. Otherwise, many a times people get confused. And then where do I put it? Many a times questions are inherently biased. I might have a bias, like for example, how often do you use mobile phones in classrooms? If I ask this to students, I'm assuming that they are using mobile phones. Of course, some of them might be doing that, but I'm just saying to make a point. Many a times my questions are double-barreled. Now this double barrel comes from that gun, the concept of double barrel gun, where you're using a gun with 2 barrels or 2 pipes, where it fires 2 bullets at the same time. So here the question is targeting 2 things at the same time. Like for example, do you think the community orientation program helps in improving communication and problem solving skills? Now, if I'm a respondent and if I say that yes, it's improved my communication skills, now this question gives me 2 things. How do I answer that? If I say yes, communication, yes, but not problem solving, and if I have the option yes and no, what do I do? Or if I say yes, problem solving skills have improved, but not the communication. Again, I'm in a dilemma, I'm in a fix. So split it into 2. Don't keep things like this. Make response categories clear and logical. Now again, it's important that we keep it very clear and logical in a sequence. Many a times, sometimes the sequences are jumbled. And again, that response category should be ideally similarly split, or if you want to an extent, and then after that, a wide category after that, more than that, whatever. Use complete sentences and plan ahead. Again, a few things. Before I go forward, let me just show you, again, example. If I put up a question like this, most pediatricians use fipronil syrup than any other brand of paracetamol. And then I ask, do you use fipronil syrup? Is there anything wrong with this? I'm sure that participants must be thinking that, no, that's fairly okay. But if you look at it, see, I have given that information in the beginning. Now, why do I need to? My purpose is I want to know what do they use, or if at all they use fipronil syrup. Now, why do I want to say most pediatricians? Now it conditions me, preconditions me. So I'll say, okay, because most use, I would like to be in that category, and I'll say yes. Or I say, how would you rate the workshop? Satisfactory, good, or excellent? Now I've already kind of given you a biased question. That means I've not given you a response where you can say poor or unsatisfactory. So this is all examples of bias. This is an example of visual analog. Works out very well where people can actually market because they actually kind of identify better with this rather than many times asking them or responding. So this is again a good idea. Example of a visual analog scale, which has been used actually in one of the questionnaires. Now coming to formatting. Now we've talked about creating questions, now formatting. So now formatting the questions, now that's again important. So we need to keep in mind appearance, length and order of questions. Now when we go with the appearance, it should be like, always presentable, because if I look at a questionnaire and then I find it presentable, I'll be more interested, whether it's an online e-questionnaire or Google form or actual questionnaire. So again, begin with an introduction, which I've told you. Try to have initial questions which are easy and avoiding controversy. If you remember the popular KBC, Kaun Banega Crorepati, they start with questions, 1,000, 2,000, and many times when you're watching, you say, oh, this is so easy, I would have answered it. But as you know that as they progress, they start becoming more difficult, right? And of course, 50 lakh and 1 crore question is difficult. So similarly, why? Because you can't just, get the participants off right in the beginning. Address important topics rather than late. You ask them early itself. Why? So that you gather most of the information early itself before they lose or they get fatigued. Maintain the flow of questions. Go in that flow. And all those questions which are on similar topic, they should be grouped together. This is again, many of the Western literature suggests that keep your demographics in the end. There are diverse views. Usually in the subcontinent, we use it with the beginning, but it's up to you. We have tried this out, works well. The thing is, what they say is, if you keep it in the end, see, by that time you have already gathered most of the information that you require. Now, by that time you reach the end, nobody will refuse to give you the demographics, whatever the basic things like about experience, marital status and things like that. Print and easy to read interface. Okay, so that's again important. And this is very important. Many times you will have questions, certain questions in the beginning, then later, and you will say yes, no, don't know. So 1, 2, and 3. And later, after say question number 5 or 6, and then you go into some other types of questions, and then you come to number 16 and you say yes, don't know, no. So participants get confused. So keep that same thing. 1, 2, and 3 should be in same order throughout the questionnaire. Try avoiding to keep turning the page halfway through, whether it's the question halfway through or the options halfway through. So it should be not done. It should be continuous. So try formatting it that way. Instructions should be distinguishable from the questions itself, and try to pre-code as many as possible, because then it becomes much easier for you even later to analyze and come out with your analysis and the interpretation. And the transitional elements. So now we will move on to, like, we've understood your this thing. Now we would like to know something about you. Please tell us about yourself. Something like that. Or let's know about what you do during your free time and something like that. There could be filter and screen questions as well. Now another thing is you can also have the version specified with the date and all. Of course, you will be doing it for your ethics committee approvals or grant proposals, but it's also a good idea to put that on the first page as well as on the header or footer of each page as well. Try refraining, I've been saying this, from taking too much of data. Now coming to pre-testing, we have realized that many times people don't understand, they can't complete, the questionnaires don't reach, or they get offended, bored. So that's why people don't actually lead to giving you the data, or questionnaires fail. So that's the reason. So how do you go about? You start pre-testing or piloting it, and you try to go in the same way that you have planned for the actual study. So that will give you an idea about, on a smaller sample, so what is the response rate, completion rate, how exactly it's behaving, is it giving you exact data, what is required, and things like that. And based on that, you can modify. So you can do that. So coming to pre-testing, you can ask the colleagues to review your questionnaire critically, then try to look at the representative population and pre-test it. Actual procedure of data collection can be simulated, and then you can assess whether the questions are producing the information that you want. You can try the entire procedure, including the tabulation and analysis, and based on that, if required, you can revise it. So that's about the whole thing of questionnaire. So just to quickly summarize, please remember, you need to have these questions in mind, and also who will you ask, what is the sampling, How will you use this information? How will you analyze? Who will you present it to and how will you present it? And then keep in mind all these things and go about constructing it. So that's about this. As I've already told you these, I will move forward because in the interest of time, I think I'll skip the things on reliability and validity. I will go forward with Likert scale because some people may want. So Likert scale basically is a scale, as Vijayalakshmi has told you, one of the rating scales, and which is very popular and straightforward. Now, when you start to build a Likert scale right from scratch, please remember a few things. It's always a series of statements. Many times we see Likert scales with questions. Ideally, Likert scale should have a statement. The difference is you never say, do you feel like, or what do you think? It will be, I feel that current pandemic is really bad. So it's not, do you feel that current pandemic is bad? Okay, and then response choices. This she has already shown you. So you have a series of statements and then you have responses. Now you can have 3 point, 5 point, 7 point, whatever. Now, usually the policy is, again, no opinion is one of the things which many times gives you that option, and then people take that because they don't want to, like, be on either side. So that becomes an issue sometimes. And if you really want to elicit something which you want really from the participant and don't want that no opinion kind of a thing on neutral, so in that case, you can avoid that option and that becomes a forced Likert scale. That means you will give them an option only of strongly agree, agree, disagree, strongly disagree, or say agree and disagree only, not, in between anything. How do you develop? Now, whenever you're starting, you assemble a statement pool, compose a statement pool, and then please remember, if you're planning for a Likert scale with some number of statements, always have 30 to 50, I would say 50% at least more. So if I'm thinking of 10, at least 15 or 16 statements I should start with. Okay, try to keep each issue or each kind of thing have more than more than one kind of a statement pool. Now, content may be derived from pilot inquiries, your review of literature, interviews, questionnaire or discussion with peers, colleagues and all. Okay, and try having more than one of each aspect. Now, how do you write? Now, each statement should have only one idea. Again, no double barreling or no dichotomous. Be meaningful and interesting, each of these statements. At the same time, try avoiding double negative because people get confused. Try to keep it short so that people understand it easily. And try not to give under that, again, sub options or subordinate clauses. So when you start with that, how do you go about validating? So if you are starting with a new one, so look at each statement and decide whether it represents a favorable or positive thing or a negative thing. That means whether the option which you've given, whether it should be, the correct option should be positive or favorable, or it should be unfavorable. What is the correct? If it is favorable, then obviously for strongly agree, assuming that I'm developing a 5 point, so strongly agree will have 5 points given, 4 for agree, and so on. Whereas for the negative ones, where the negative option is correct, you will give unfavorable statement the highest score, that is 5. Strongly disagree will be 5. Disagree will be 4, and the other ways like that, so opposite direction. Once you have assembled all the things, then you should have a representative sample. At least 30 people should be there. Now I'll come to that, why 30 people. And then once you've done that, you administer it and then collect it, mark them, 1 mark for each of the item, and do the totaling. Once you've done that, arrange the forms in ascending order, descending order. So on the top and the highest in the bottom. Once you've done that, take the first top 10, take the lowest 10. So divide it into 3 and then discard the middle third. So you have the top 10 and the bottom 10, right? Once you've done that, now start looking at each of the statement on the scale and count the number of respondents in the upper and the lower third who scored either 4 or 5. And depending on whether it was positive or negative, decide that and then convert that number into a percentage. Okay. So once you've done that, you come out with, for each item, that is each statement, a table, which I will be showing on the following slide, and find out the difference between the two in form of percentage. So for example, the first statement I have, and then the difference is like say 90% and 30%, so 60%. Okay, similarly for each of them. So once you've done that, now based on this, you will decide whether to keep that statement or not. And this is a simple way of devising a scale and validating it. So once you have a difference of 30% or more, keep that. Whereas if it is, less than 30%, like 15%, 10%, reject them. So your final statement pool will not have that statement which resulted in less than 30%. Okay, so that's your final scale ready. So that's how you go about. And before I close, please remember, if you're using an existing questionnaire or an instrument, please remember to write to the author, corresponding author, or whoever, or the agency, and take the permission. It's important for you to do that, because if you don't do that, many times there could be issues. So you always write. And many a times my experience is, especially for people abroad, they usually respond and they are very generous. They usually give you permission as well. Coming to anonymity, many a times we say anonymity, but when we ask certain identifiers, please ensure that in case of anonymity, you don't keep any identifier there. Now, confidentiality is something like, you have the idea of things, or the information, or you have the data, but you keep it confidential. That is with the research team itself. So there is the difference between anonymity and confidentiality. Okay. Basically, confidentiality pertains to data. And many times when you say others, please specify. At least you can give that, and then let that be written by the people. And convex alpha is, again, I will not have time to deal with it right now, but that basically tells you about the items and the agreement of that. And then if the convex alpha is greater than 0.7 or 0.8, it's very good. So that means your scale is good. So to conclude, write meaningful questions, be clear about the objectives of your study, pay careful attention to the wordings of the questionnaire, and remember, the response of the information you obtain is only as good as the question that you pose. Let me end by a quote by Peter Drucker, who said, "The most serious mistakes are not being made as a result of wrong answers. The truly dangerous thing is asking the wrong questions." So with that, I conclude. These are two of the resources from the Indian Journal of Dermatology, which are good. I leave it for a few seconds for you to know. These are some of these. There are many articles actually, but these are simple articles, 2 series of articles. So you can keep that for your reference. And with that, I acknowledge some people who have been instrumental. All these are part of the Pamerly and many other people and the team, of course, today we're working with. So Janet Grant from UK, Mr. Sheetal Bhandari from Nepal, Dr. Sudha Ramlingam, Dr. Thomas Chakor, Ms. Stacy from Philadelphia, the PSG Famer Regional Institute and Mahe Famer Regional Institute at Manipal, and all my Famerly. So with that, thank you. I believe that you will have some questions, so we will take some questions now. I believe that a lot of questions are coming in, so we will take some of those questions now.
Okay, so one of the first questions is the difference between a questionnaire and a survey.
Okay.
You would like to answer that?
So basically, a survey is nothing but a way of doing it. But survey is many times Western context. Survey is equated as a questionnaire. Okay, so you are administering a questionnaire. Questionnaire is a tool basically, and you're administering it by doing a survey. Or sometimes it's equated in the same way. So many of the Western literature says survey and questionnaire are same thing or parallel. So that's the idea.
Okay. Some questions regarding validation of questionnaire. If we are designing, who will validate it? Also about pilot testing, the minimal subjects required for pilot testing.
See, validating, there are multiple things. So what you can do is, first is like, content validity, phase validity, lots of things are there. I had some slides very briefly to touch on, but I didn't have time. So what I would suggest is, first thing is, validity basically means, is it really measuring what exactly it's supposed to measure? Now, first thing is phase validity. When you look at it, you will realize whether that questionnaire is in line with the objectives. So that is the phase validity. you can check with the experts. The other thing is the content validity. Again, you can check with the experts and all. So you can do that. And then you can also send it across to experts, and there are ways of doing it. So you can, and then you can go into the criterion validity and things like that. So I think that is another thing which you can do. Basically, like, if you see here, I'm just showing you subject and research experts will help you to assess the content validity. And then when it comes to phase validity, again, you can even use target respondents. Coming to the pilot testing, you said, usually it's a small sample. Numbers wise, again, there is no definitive answer. Maybe I can request Praveen to chip in if he wants to add in, but there's no definitive answer. Many times they say percentage of that, this, but I don't have a definitive answer. But you take a good number, maybe at least 10, 15, 20 people. Sometimes they've said even 5 people is okay, because if you have a final very small sample. Praveen, can you chip in, please?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Around from 6 to 10 is the rule. So yeah, they can take experts from 6 to 10, and that variation, whatever we have between 6 to 10, is going to give some valid information to us.
Yes.
Does online or Google Form require a clearance from IEC? It does.
Yes, it does. Just because you're using an online platform doesn't mean that you don't need a ethics committee approval. It's just the way I'm administering it. So it can be Google Form, it can be telephonic interview, it can be paper-based interview, anything. But ultimately the ethics committee needs to see your the instrument. So you need to get that approval. We've just recently done that in the COVID times also through online, and we've been doing that also earlier.
Okay, can we modify standard or established questionnaires?
Okay, depends on the purpose. If you think that, if it's not really suiting your purpose or maybe cultural context, you may. But again, first thing is take permission. Take permission also for modification. Then there is a procedure. Actually, you can't just modify, because the moment you do that, the validity and the reliability changes. So you need to do that, and then again test it, and then you should see to it that it actually is doing what you intend to. So of course that's itself a very complex thing, and that it will take maybe another session to discuss that. But just briefly saying, one, yes, you can do it, but please keep remembering that you need to take permission. Second, you need to do all these things about validity and reliability and check for that, and then go ahead. So if you're doing that, you'll have to be aware of that, and it will be a little longer process than you anticipate.
All right. Another question is maximum number of demographic attributes for a study.
Again, I don't really have an answer, because maximum, I mean, the sky's the limit to, on the lighter side. But basically, see, it depends. As I said, what is your intention? Why do you need so much of demographics, if at all maximum? So you need to answer that. How are you going to handle that, and what information are you gaining from that, and how would you analyze and present it? What is your ultimate purpose? So based on that, you will decide. It's not that you need to have too many things.
Okay, there are some questions on Likert scale. What stats to use for their analysis, and also, yeah. Okay, continue.
Okay, so just quickly to tell you before I ask again Praveen to chip in. So basically, see, it depends. Many times you may just want to convert it into numbers, and then you might want to have a median score. Sometimes even mean scores used. But depends. Or otherwise, you might want to and sometimes people also combine agree and strongly agree, which again kind of defeats the purpose. But sometimes they will also give percentages. But again, I'll ask Praveen to chip in, and I think he will be again be able to give you a better idea.
Yeah, Rashmi ma'am, can you ask that question again to me?
Basically, they asked that what are the statistical analysis tests
exactly
to use for Likert scale.
Yeah, the same answer as you gave, sir. If they give categorical variables, for example, only strongly agree and all, which are there in terms of number and percentage, we apply chi-square. And if we calculate the overall scores, and if we have to compare between the groups, then we go for parametric or non-parametric test of significance, like unpaired t-test, paired t-test.
Okay. So I think somebody wants to, yes. Are there any other questions? Okay. Some Rakshas wants to ask a question, I think.
Yeah, I
If we can unmute.
Good evening, sir.
Yeah, she's
Yeah,
Could you hear
okay,
me?
Raksha, tell me. Yeah, I
Yeah,
can.
thank you for the
Please tell
session,
me.
sir. So I had this question since I will be choosing a dissertation topic soon for my MPhil research.
Okay.
So since my population currently, I would be taking a population from Karnataka. There are
Mhm.
some questionnaires which I would like to translate. So is there any particular code of conduct with respect to translation that I need to be aware of? That is something which I would like to ask because
Okay, so very good question, Raksha. Let me just try to give you in brief. Okay, now if I presume that you're using a standard available questionnaire to
yes,
translate, right?
yes,
Okay, so now again, if you're using that, again use permissions and things like that. Now, if already there is a standard translated version available, or somebody has used it earlier in the language that you want to use, try to use that. Okay, if not, if you're planning to translate, then there are a lot of things involved. One, you need to translate it in such a way that it carries the essence and it's a proper translation. Second, once you've done that, you need to check that validity and reliability. Now, again, a lot of things. But before that, you do that again. Once you have translated, there is supposed to be a back translation. So, say, suppose you have done it from English to Kannada, for example. Now, you need to translate the Kannada version again back to English by a person who's not seen the English version. Okay, so and again it should match, because sometimes in the translation we lose out. So that's another thing which you need to do. Once you've done that, you need to run this and see to it that it goes in the way, or it gives you the data as it's expected to. Okay, so all that has to be done, and you need to check for the validity and reliability as well. Another thing is, many times there are agencies which have questionnaires. I'll give you my example. One of the bronchial asthma survey questionnaire that we were using. Now, there was some agency in UK which was having these questions. So we wrote to them, and then we wanted even some translated version. And believe me, they had these Hindi, Kannada, and some other versions, and they said that they don't allow translation. They have a particular MAPI Institute in France is their agency which is authorized to do that, and even if we wanted, they would want that agency to do it, and they will provide us. Okay, so they don't want other people to do that. So something like that. So that's why I said you need to have explicit permission, and also permission for translation and things like that. Okay,
so we can ask them if they already have a translated version.
if they have, and if they have a particular, or if they would be able to provide. If not, then you'll have to go through the things that I told you.
So it would be treated just as a new questionnaire altogether. So the process remains the same, like
Yes,
validity.
yes, because see, once you translate, see, it is again, see, we've not tested it out.
Yes. Okay. Yes, sir. Got it. Thank you so much, sir.
Okay, welcome. Yeah, what is that?
Deepraj Paul has also raised hand.
Yeah,
Maybe he would
Deepraj, Deepraj, you've been unmuted. Can you please ask your question?
Yeah, good evening, sir. It's
Good
very
evening.
nice session. I have a question regarding this pre-test and pilot test.
Okay.
The question actually splits into two parts. First one, does this pre-test forms the base for the pilot test? And if not, what is the difference between pre-test and pilot test?
In a way, I would say that it's same. You can actually equate it. That's why I think one of my slides, I don't know whether I projected, but it was pre and pilot can be similar or same thing. Okay, so you can do that. What is the next question?
Some of the materials they have shown it as different, but
no, that's what
it doesn't give a clear-cut meaning. So I was waiting for a chance where I can get this kind of opportunity to ask a direct question regarding pre-test and pilot test. So I asked, but
okay. What's the next part of your question?
If they are not same, in which way they are different? So that was the question.
Okay, Praveen, do you have any other opinion or anything that you can chip in with?
Yeah, the context, it all depends on the context. If the context is, if you want to test the cognition level of the questionnaire, or if you want to look whether your questionnaire is, making a sense or not, when you do that, that becomes a pilot study. That is one part of the pilot study. Sometimes the pre-test is not the term used for piloting. Sometime what we do is I collect the data. For example, before giving a particular educational intervention, I collect some data, baseline data of the subjects. That is also called as a pretest. Okay, the term using of pretest is a very contextual. If you use a pre-testing of questionnaire, some people tell it as pre-tested structured questionnaire. In that context, pre-testing has been done to know whether the questionnaire is working properly or not. It is making sense or not. That's why it is called as a pre-tested questionnaire. Sometimes the pre-test is used for, collecting the baseline information. Okay. So when you want to make an interpretation, be very clear what is the context at which you are interpreting your term pre-test.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. Because what I saw in one of the syllabus, they have given pre-test and pilot test both together. So that gave the impression like both are different. And when I've gone through the explanation, it gave an idea like pre-test forms the basic tool to form the what you call that questionnaire for pilot test.
Yes.
So I remember that.
Yes.
I think we have the last raised hand now. So
Deepti Nagraj.
Deepti Nagraj, you have been unmuted. Can you please ask your question?
Thank you, sir. Sir, I have a question. Suppose my questionnaire is in English, and
Yes.
it's very simple, and I've been collecting data by using interview method. So then, can I just ask the questionnaire in the local language, and then can I record the responses on my English questionnaire? Is it possible?
Good question, Deepti. Thank you for bringing up this. Now, I would suggest that you better translate it, because what happens is 2-3 things. See, now I know that you said that you are collecting it, but again, every time you actually go and ask the question in the local language, you may not ask the same thing. One. Second, you have not really looked at whether it is validated. So it's always good that you translate it and then at least have that in back translation done and to see that. Okay, so that would be the least I would suggest, because in that way variations won't be there. And if at all there are different people administering that questionnaire by interviewing, like if you're using that interview schedule for different people, then there will be uniformity across.
Okay, sir. Thank you very much, sir.
Okay.